then that's where you always have these type of fire drills. Something comes up, the Strait of Hormuz comes up, or you have rare earths coming up, and they respond to that like a firefighting exercise. And a lot of times you will then also think, you will look maybe out of the building, see something burning, say, well, it's not me, it's them because of X, Y, Z, and not realizing really it doesn't matter in which sector you are, you will become impacted, or there's a risk of you becoming impacted by this new type of operating environment.
Everyone, hello. Welcome back to the Potentia podcast. Today we have Max Zenglein here. He is the Asia Pacific Senior Economist at the Conference Board in Singapore. Max, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks.
I know you're focusing on economic security. Before we jump into everything, for listeners working on different aspects of research or different realms, we have a lot of buzzwords right now, like industrial policy, economic security, economic sovereignty. Can you give us an idea of what you define as economic security as the basis for our conversation?
I think that's an excellent point, because this is actually also something that has motivated me to look into this topic a bit more, because I've been part of a lot of conversations, track 1.5 formats, for example, or some type of panel discussions. And everybody's talking about precisely this economic security, geoeconomics. And I feel like if you get a bit deeper into the conversation, you question whether everybody's really talking about the same thing. So as a starting point, the first point to distinguish is that economic security means something very different for a government than for a company. And that's some of the tensions. So, of course, the overarching goal is to become less exposed to external factors that use leverage against you, that you become more resilient in a more uncertain type of environment. But how you achieve that, and kind of also what your hierarchy of that is and how you prioritize, means very different things for different actors, depending on the specifics of your country in terms of size and capabilities. And the same goes for companies, how exposed they are, how sophisticated their supply chains are, how high up in the tech hierarchy they are. So I think in a nutshell, it is about preparing yourself for uncertainty within the means you have, and identifying the vulnerabilities and strengths you have in this type of environment.
I think it's interesting. I've been having a lot of conversations in the space as well. Lately, I've been focused a lot more on the economic market environment for AI development. I came from supply chain logistics. I've also done work at Boeing, so I've been on both sides. And what I did notice similarly is I feel like sometimes we have conversations, but we're speaking about different things. With that in mind, you have the pleasure of being at the intersection of a lot of different stakeholders. So, what are some of the conversations that you're having right now? Because there's a lot going on.
Yeah, I think even within government, where the term economic security has advanced, you do notice vast differences in terms of also organizational setup. And I think that's a key point to kind of recognize that a lot of governments and institutions are not built to improve economic security. I think that's already a first kind of assessment that also shows some differences on how governments operate. Others have advanced more, others have stronger, maybe national security institutions that are now connecting to the economic sphere. But for others, there is a clear gap in terms of how they're pursuing their economic objectives and priorities, and how they mingle them with national security elements, which for a big chunk of the past decades have been largely separated and came up at different times, but there wasn't much interaction. That means the institutions and the people that are operating it are often not prepared. So there is a sense of urgency. We've seen this development accelerate in some countries. I mean, I would say Japan is a forerunner. They started to adjust around 2010, I would argue. Likewise, China is a country that has been a forerunner of this. So they've identified and viewed economic security as a national objective that is important, where government objectives align with those of corporates. Those are some of the tensions that we're seeing in countries that are less prepared, but are now really under acute pressure to, basically scramble to respond. I think that's one first observation on a government level. For company level, maybe that's a different question.
Okay, we're going to jump into the conversation at different points. I'm wondering if you can talk more about that gap. I've noticed that as well. I come from expertise focusing on communist, post communist states, as well as being a US citizen. I'm aware of this environment as well. But I'm wondering if you can speak more about that gap because I think that's a poignant issue that we're seeing right now. And I'm wondering your thoughts on it.
As I mentioned, in government, I think this is a bit more advanced. It's a term that is easily used, but it's not corporate language to talk about economic security. Maybe some companies in defense, for them, it's something they have thought about, even though I won't think about so much as economic security. It was more about preserving. There was always export controls and restricting some type of access. But I don't think even in that case, economic security was such an overarching topic that had operational impact. Now, economic security is having or should be having or is starting to have an operational impact. I think that's where these tensions are coming in. And it's a concept that for companies can mean different things. One, it can mean to improve their overall resilience. We've had this topic about vulnerabilities, whether it's rare earths or other parts of the supply chain, such as semiconductor. Companies have had their vulnerabilities exposed and are responding in the context of economic security. So, but that's more the defense kind of part. But there's also an offensive element to economic security that connects how a company's operational decision connect to, for example, industrial policy decisions that governments are bringing forward as they're trying to promote certain key sectors or reduce certain vulnerabilities by strengthening capabilities, which essentially they will need companies to do that. I think that's something where companies are at very different stages. They're probably best in discussing the defensive parts, the vulnerability parts. But even here, you will have tensions where you have companies that are well in place in identifying certain risks and vulnerabilities. And then they will say in their assessment, okay, we need to diversify. Well, does that information translate to the procurement department, whose KPI is still to reduce costs and in order to stay competitive? So there's a tension in that sphere. I think that's an example of how, because it's a still so loosely defined concept, it's not understood in the broader range throughout many organizations as they're trying to catch up and respond. And that's where you always have these type of like fire drills, like something comes up, the Strait of Hormuz comes up, or you have rare earths coming up and they respond to that. Yeah, it's like a firefighting exercise. And a lot of times you will then also think you will look maybe out of the building, see something burning, and say, well, it's not me, it's them because of X, Y, and not realizing really it doesn't matter in which sector you are, you will become impacted, or there's a risk of you impacted by this new type of operating environment.
I think it's interesting. There's so many facets of I love how you put the fire drill part. I have visceral memories back to when I was at Boeing and we would have events pop up and that would be how the response was. Just I think there's a level of volatility in the world right now that we're experiencing that was not at such frequency as speed over perhaps the last decade or two. Of course there were events, but not at this frequency or speed. To drill a little bit more, you are at the intersection, you're in Singapore, home base for companies going into Asia, and now even companies moving out of Asia into broader markets abroad. So I'm curious, when you're speaking about companies, can you give me an idea of what you mean by companies? What type of actors are we talking about?
Okay. My exposure is mainly to multinationals of origin. This is very diverse. It includes companies from the US and as well as Europe, but also within Asia. That gives me a relatively wide range of exposure. It also shows the complexity that you have. You have people on the ground that maybe come to some conclusions, but then they have to communicate with headquarters. To answer your question more specifically, these are all companies that are large and have very global operations, and they must respond to the situation. So they're not as nimble as maybe some SMEs place. So it's a much bigger ship that needs to maneuver in this time of turbulence that you have. Of course, you'd think they have more resources, but it also becomes more difficult to oversee who is actually the person making the decision in terms of economic security. So this is something I find identifying the people that are working on the topic is a very difficult task. Like, even though everybody's talking about it, if you ask him, so like, who's responsible for this? It's a whole different question. And how are you guys cooperating amongst each other? Very different question. I think this is just for me a reflection of how unprepared a lot of companies are in building up to respond in a I want to say less emotional attitude, as it's a very stressful situation. Using the fire drill example is something that comes by surprise, and then you scramble and you realize that you didn't really train for this operation. You might get out the door and think, oh, this went well, but you don't realize maybe it was just pure luck. To have these mechanisms in place that everything kind of combines, I think there's huge gaps within companies.
I'm interested because multinational companies fascinate me. I'm doing a deep dive on the origin of the corporate structure right now for another research project. But I would love your opinion. So, obviously, we have multinational companies, very diverse. But in terms of how they're working to fill these gaps, obviously, it's an evolving issue. But are you seeing certain companies perhaps succeeding a bit more at this versus others? You don't have to name names, but in terms of when I think, okay, China has set industrial policy, KPIs, goals with 15 5-year plan. It has that relationship between the state and the companies, whereas perhaps foreign companies don't. And then if a company is registered in Singapore or acting there, it's not necessarily Chinese. But when I think about the way a company operates, I would say, okay, well, perhaps there's a bit more closeness in the goals that China is able to enact down through its companies, whereas there's still that disconnect with multinational companies. And that includes, some Chinese companies as well. With that in mind, I'm just wondering if you see some companies succeeding more than others in terms of closing that gap or meeting these challenges. There's a lot of hiring right now in terms of geopolitical risk positions. We see people hiring economists. So just wondering if you're seeing anyone doing well.
Let's see how I answer this. So
Oh
yes,
yeah, no,
there's
it's a broad question.
I use this term a lot in recent formats, and it's something in German you would say. So I'm German, so I'll
Oh, my
use this.
cousin's German. Okay.
So the term is Aktionismus, which means doing something for the purpose of doing something because you're in an environment where you think you need to do something. So I think we see a lot of that at the
Mhm.
moment.
Very
And
true.
a critical point is there is certain limitations what an individual company can do in navigating this. So they need to make choices. So if I would like on a very high level point out to where this works, it's governments and key companies are aligned on things. The more resistance you have, overall, you're going to struggle to achieve anything in economic security. For a government, you're not going to achieve that if your company is not aligned. For a company, you might have some short-term stability, but then you will get in the crosshairs down the line for something because you've made choices on something. So I think we're at the stage where, in terms of, well, like you mentioned, positive example, the most compelling I would see would actually be Japan. So Japan government and its companies. So they already have the institutions in place, economic security ministry. They have detailed work with JETRO. So it's a government institution with a global footprint that connects with corporate interests. So there's a lot of work going on in that space. At a very different pace, I would also point out China. You already alluded to that, but it works very differently. But there is alignment between corporate and government interests for the large part. Whereas I think in a lot of the rest of the world, at least with the larger economies in the US or Europe, I would say there's disalignment for the most. You never know, are they working together or not? And there's tensions between on economic security grounds because it's seen as a cost. And effectively, the question is, okay, let's cooperate on economic security. And you as a company, we're going to ask you to spend more money to become less efficient. That's not a great kind of prospect that you're having. So I think that kind of explains a resistance in this type of alignment. Not saying there's no tensions in Japan or in China on this, but I think they're on the overarching direction and trajectory, they're more aligned. And I think for a lot of other countries here in the region, especially in Southeast Asia, they're not even at that point yet. It's just being governments are trying to sign free trade agreements and highlight they're diversifying, and companies just kind of scramble along. I think they have not really raised this question. There's a lot of, I think, I was going to say optimism, but I would call it more wishful thinking that things will be all right. They will just kind of navigate these tensions and maybe even benefit from being in between maybe great power tensions that are rising. So it's a very fluid space, I would say, overall. So very messy.
What the company said, government's very messy. And I think I've seen a lot of the similar threads that you've brought up. You are an expert in this realm. How do you go about distinguishing between what is a political signal and then what is a real constraint? Because we see a lot of that, I think, nowadays. I'm wondering how you approach it in your research.
I wish I'd figured that out in total, but my approach in this has been the gap and trying to understand why there is a gap. And that means going back to the basics and trying to understand why are we here where we got. I think there's a lot of not understanding why we're here. And then you will have arguments brought forward. Global trade is at record levels, fine. Actually, the impact isn't that big. We have a little bit of reconfiguration. And I think a lot don't see the writing on the wall yet, where it's heading and how fundamental the shifts are that are unfolding now and in which direction this is going. Because that's another question. Where are we heading? What's the new global trading regime going to look like? It's completely uncertain. So my approach is trying to understand the basics and understand more the government direction and approach to this, because that's going to pave the way for which companies then need to follow it. Whether or not they follow it is a whole different story. But I think it's understanding that and translating the government speak on a corporate level. I think that's kind of the stage where my research or my thinking is, but it's not an easy task. As I mentioned earlier, it's not corporate language to talk economic security. And I think to make matters worse, even though there is a lot of people talking about this topic, I truly have my doubts that there's a lot of really experts in this realm. And I myself wouldn't consider myself one. I didn't go to school for this. I'm an economist. I grew up with trade liberalization and reducing barriers of trade. That's a whole different concept. So I think a lot of the structural thinking going into this requires us to going back toward the fundamentals and understanding the gaps we have in our thinking, because the intersection of the international relations sphere, security sphere, and economic sphere is something I think there's very few that have this experience and can draw conclusions from their experience that they've had. I think that requires a lot of self-reflection of anybody working on this. What are the limitations? And then see how it can be best translated from government to academics and to corporates to have that triangle. I think that's very important. I've been at very few formats where I've had all of these three talking together. It's usually think tanks or academia talking with each other, sometimes with government or more government. Maybe you have like corporate, some type of involvement, but usually very limited. I think these hard questions are important, but they're very difficult because there's a lot of resistance to having these conversations because there's a trust issue. So I'm interested in this topic, but we can only talk about this on the surface level and we can't really go deeper. So that means the real juicy conversations are not happening in public space, and it's different to assess how advanced they are. And I realize also in these conversations, I have to be mindful of what I say. So that's not very helpful for a starting.
I think it's good to be aware it's a pragmatic approach, but it is fascinating because we are at this point in time where we have a scale of multinational corporations, companies operating in a way that we have not seen before. My focus areas of interest right now with these questions, we're looking at economic security, national security, non-state actors. For instance, I was looking into uh, potential export controls that we were looking at between the United States and the Soviet Union and that type of thing. But it's a completely different context and environment in terms of political will, the dynamic between multinational companies, state. So I think you bring up a lot of good questions, uh, but it does come down a lot to that trust factor. I think it also is not wanting these different parties don't want to relinquish power. And then, yes, we do get these siloed bits of thinking. So, hoping that we could expand that conversation. This podcast is partially a project to do that. But I wanted to get into some case studies. You just had a recent article come out if we're talking about great power players. Um, it was The Economist. The title is A Trade War Between the EU and China Seems Inevitable. And this comes off the tail of President Trump and President Xi's summit, where Xi Jinping introduced the Thucydides trap. And then we apply this to the EU aspect. So, wondering, share your thoughts on that, because this is a clear representation of big powers interacting. What do you think about it?
Could have a whole episode on this when it comes
Yeah.
to China. This has been an area I've, in my previous role, worked on for a very long time. Last week, there was a EU summit that included trying to formulate new decisions on China, and they chose actually not to take any for this point. This comes from Europe being under acute pressure. Europe is under acute pressure on a lot of dimensions, but one of them relates to China on the economic front. But there is no unity on the approach Europe should take vis-a-vis China. This already goes to some of the points we've issued. The EU's mandate is to protect the single market, mainly on the economics front. It doesn't have a national security mandate. That is for the member states. And that's already the problem for economic security at the intersection of this. There is already a lot of tensions, which means it would mean unity by member states to enable the EU to take measures that relate to economic security, which in default would mean they're giving up some of their sovereignty to the EU, which there's a lot of internal resistance and that could domestically backfire. I think it's important to have that context. For this reason, it's important to see how China views any defensive measures that Europe might be drawing up. They're going to resist it as much as they can because their perception is the EU is relatively weak and they have a window where they can influence the decision making by threats, like threatening the rare earth things and threatening some vulnerable industries or key players, maybe directly communicating with them. So there's a lot of touch points how they can influence the decision making because they view them as weak. This is something that's happening. Now, just in contrast to Japan, they have a very clear stance on their position vis-a-vis China. They understand their vulnerabilities. And if China threatens to cut them off from rare earth, they say, okay, that's great. We've known this for 15 years. We will proceed as we have planned. So that's a huge gap. Shows also that how, in this case, China acts very differently depending on who they're playing with. And the same goes to the US. They also play differently on who the opposite is. Now, if you put a company in that, how are they going to navigate that? They have to make their own call. Who's credible? Who's not credible? Which legislation or regulation am I going to follow? Which one I'm not going to follow? The one says diversify. The other one says improve resilience of your supply chains. This is a gigantic mess. And how are we going to make a decision on this? I think this is reflecting the uncertainty we're in. And if you move away from all the noise, you're realizing, boil it down on a personal level, there's a lot of psychology going on right now. I think the best way to abstract that, I tend to not follow the news that much anymore to kind of to see the big picture, but you need to boil it down and think of it in terms of game theory. How are different actors viewing the probabilities to understand what the outcome is? And so at least I think, it was maybe a bit of a messy answer, but I think that's reflective of where we are. And it also requires to rethink our methodologies and how we understand it.
I think you put it quite well. It's interesting. We have a very, not just strong China, we've seen that over the last decade, but also a very bold China now, depending on which actor they're interacting with. We have Japan starting to reshore national security interests. They have very fixed stance on their economy, but at the same time, they do also have a lot of things that they're cooperating with the Chinese on. Whereas they have that boundary, like you said. It's not my place of expertise, but I have some friends that are more focused on that. Whereas then in Southeast Asia, we see a broader diffusion of Chinese influence, which has been interesting because traditionally we've seen a lot of Western influence there. And then it's interesting to see the EU in terms of its relationships with what was traditionally an ally on the economic and security front of the United States. We still technically are, perhaps in some realms, but it's been quite shaky lately. And that has opened up vulnerabilities. And then there's dynamics within the EU itself in terms of Brexit and everything going on there. I'm wondering, have you looked at specifically whether that be in the Southeast Asia market, or EU?
EVs,
Yeah, electric vehicles.
it's at the forefront of a lot of developments that we're having. There has been a lot of underestimation of China's industrial policy and connecting industrial policy to economic security. The whole reason this started to become a priority in China is because they want to reduce their energy dependency on fossil fuels. Automotive is an interesting sector, but they understood this is an industrial policy decision that helps them to leapfrog in a sector, automotive, and at the same time reduce their energy dependency if it pans out. So that already shows, that's why I mentioned China and Japan being more advanced in this thinking is a result of that. They received a lot of support and it was a priority sector. Now we have very competent and innovative, not very profitable, but innovative companies that are extremely capable in this realm. They're also going abroad. I think it's also to keep in mind that the globalization that we're seeing of Chinese companies and also EVs, everything is connected to geopolitics. There's a huge domestic factor to this just because of where China's economic development is. This would be a natural stage for them to go abroad. So Southeast Asia is pretty much at the forefront. It's in their neighborhood, so it's coming in. And here I think that's an interesting tension that is brewing because this is also Southeast Asia, the Japanese footprint, also in automotive is very strong, but mainly in the combustion engines. This is now creating a race to who can attract more Chinese investments, but then what does it do for the investments that Japanese have already in place? So it's used as a token to negotiate and to play this game. And we see the same in Europe. Spain taking a more positive approach towards China and not wanting to be very combative because they see some opportunities like, wow, the Chinese EVs are coming in. They're hurting the Germans. We can build up and attract some investments. And I think that's kind of the trouble in finding any form of unity because there is still this emphasis to kind of get a short-term advantage in this. There's a lack of bigger picture understanding of that. EVs are an example of the nexus of industrial policy and economic security. It is how investments are used for political gain. And it also shows how rapidly Chinese companies are globalizing in this environment. And that's creating a lot of competition that is going to become a feature of the new reality unfolding.
I think when we're looking at economic security at a systems level, we do have, as you mentioned before, you brought up kind of the competing interests of multinational companies. Then we have even just the demographic of people within a country, and then the EU, all the different states. So I'm wondering, do you see any potential for political will to unite, whether this be in Southeast Asia, the EU? I think China has quite strong political will, as this is a national objective that we see. I'm wondering what your take on it is from a government perspective for other actors.
There is a will, but it has limits. I think for the most part, and this be oversimplifying a little bit, but countries in Southeast Asia and as well of Europe, nobody wants confrontation. Nobody wants to pick a side. And I think it's also important to note that, and again, this is the psychology effect. You have rapidly deteriorating trust in the US as a security provider. So it's deteriorating. So and China is stable. I think it's fair to say also here in Southeast Asia, nobody's like extremely happy and going to go completely into China's camp because they have security issues with them. But they have to deal and navigate with a very unpredictable US and a predictable China for the most part. But Does it automatically make him the better partner? No. So they're caught in between. And I think it's important to realize if you look at a lot of governments here, how they're set up, there's limited capacity that they have to shift their attention. Maybe before it wasn't that desperate with the US, so they could focus on China and manage that. Now you have to take a big chunk of that capacity and shift it to dealing with whatever the US is throwing at you. So I think that's also an element that we need to consider. At the same time, there is very little cooperation amongst countries here. Everybody's trying to navigate on their own short-term interests, trying to, maybe this is an opportunity. Maybe I can attract another data center or an EV factory and play in the grounds, or I can be, benefiting from any type of changes in investment flows, or I'll just stay on the fence as much as possible. But I'm going to see my neighborhood as a competitor. I will say I want to cooperate and we're the middle powers, but effectively we are in competition. That's complicated.
What happens if these actors fail to ensure themselves with economic security? This dual track going back and forth between different actors makes sense in terms of seeing which will gain more traction. But if, whether it be a company or a government, if they fail to achieve economic security, what could you envision as happening, either on a more pragmatic level or if you want to go all the way to worst case scenario?
Well, they'll be confronted with economic coercion. That's going to be the reality. And it is going to be a power play. And then it's about them to decide, okay, what am I going to respond to and which hit am I willing to take? So I think at this moment, there's been mostly rhetoric and not much immediate impact. That's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out when countries are forced to make power moves. I don't think we've reached that point yet. I think the most focus has been on US tariffs. I mean, how long has this been going on? It's way over a year. There's new rulings coming in. I mean, effectively,
Yeah.
I've taught a lot of the companies already in May they should not pay attention to the tariffs. Eventually, maybe they will land or not, but any operational decision based on that would be a complete nightmare. Nothing has really happened on that front. So I think it's about the real clash points and where either a country or a company are going to get caught up in that. And it's going to be on very different dimensions. But I don't think we have had this power play really come to play yet. And I think that's something, my prediction would be 2027 sometime, but let's see.
We shall see. Two more questions before I let you go. So, in terms of the conversations that you're having, do you find that they're more productive when you're speaking with, say, government actors or multinational companies? Which do you think is having urgency and you feel as though you see potentially more productive outcomes for them?
Well, that would depend on which company and which government I'm talking to. I
True.
think so. No, I don't think
Yeah.
there's a clear answer to that. I mean, what is observable, I'm not going to mention
Secrets.
governments in Japan, where I think it's well known. There are some
Hmm.
differences in terms of how governments are active here in the region. And for any company operating, the first step is to understand what's happening in the government space and then translating that. Because if you're preparing for something, but it's like preparing in a laboratory and then you put it in the real world, it's like, oh, this is not working very well. I think there's a process in understanding the adjustments that governments are taking to be in a better position for a company to identify what's credible and what's not credible and how it will impact operational decisions. So the successful companies would be the ones who are investing and doing their homework now to be in a position to make better decisions. So I think we can't answer that question yet.
Okay, so last question. We touched on a lot of different points, and something that stuck out to me was you mentioned we have to go back, we have to look at ourselves, our limitations, our biases, we have to look at foundations. We see a lot of psychology plays, game theory. For anyone acting in this space, what is a word of advice you would give them or something you would recommend for them to look into as we move forward?
Have a 360 view as much as possible. and leave your lines of thinking and expose yourself to counter arguments. In this fluid space, there is a tendency to, this comes from a lot of conversation, which I find are binary. It's an either or. The trouble is, this is not an either or. It's going to be in between. Sometimes it's an either or, but in aggregate, it's going to be kind of a gray zone. Expose yourself to different viewpoints and think about the arguments and understand the other side of whatever you're looking into, I think is very helpful. Looking and understanding what a government wants to achieve, that's great. If I independently look at what a company wants to achieve, that's also great. But you need to understand, okay, what does the government want to achieve? How does this mean for a company? The government wants to roll out these measures. That means effectively it's more costs for this company, or this company has a massive investment footprint in China. Like how they're going to get out of this means decisions will need to be made, but exposing yourself to the complexity of the opinions and viewpoints that are shaping the new reality is very important. It's very exhausting, but I think it's important not to be, you don't want to be in one single camp. I think that would be a stress point when you're talking to people, that it's not really quite clear, like, oh, he's not driven by ideology or like a specific hard-nosed thing, because the reality is the solution or the approach is going to differ very much from country to country and company to company. And I think you can only capture that if you expose yourself to a very complex type of the variety of opinions.
Actually, I have one more question. With the rise of companies going abroad, we saw globalization. When we look back in history books, do you think that we will still see this era as one of globalization, or will we call it deglobalization, fragmentation? Do you still see us as having globalization going on, or would you call it something else?
I think it's still globalization, and I'm working on a paper on
Oh,
precisely that, but we're shifting from a liberalized globalization to a securitized globalization. And we're figuring that out and how that works. And I think for a lot of companies operating and redefining the globalization in sync with governments, this will mean some choices. That means the form of globalization that we have is going to be a very different one. And especially for multinational companies that thrive on cross-border flows of everything, they will need to be confronted about the restrictions on cross-border flow of everything. It's not just supply chains, it's data, it's people, knowledge, capital. That's going to have an impact on how you do research and whatnot. And for some, a very uncomfortable reality, for some parts of a global business, these will no longer be able to run as global businesses. Whereas in others, they will figure it out. But there are going to be some red lines where it's just not going to work. And so you will have a certain element of the globalization that we know of now that is going to be deglobalized. We're now in the process of defining which areas that are going to be. I think that's kind of the catchphrase that will define whether or not we still consider that's globalization or not. There is going to be a form of globalization, but it's just going to be a very different one. And you mentioned the historical aspects of that, especially the generation that are in the workforce right now. They've taken the past 30 years for granted. It's the exception. I think that's also a reality. And it shows the limitations of what humanity wants to achieve together, because at the end, there's a lot of power play that comes into force. It's the process of unwinding the strangeness that has been positive for many over the past 30 years. But the reason this is now falling apart is because a lot of people were not happy about the past 30 years. My overarching title for how I view is that it's the era of unhappiness. Everybody's unhappy about something and responding to that. So on that happy note,
is that unhappiness, or were we bored? It depends who we're talking about. Where we'll see globalization with securitization characteristics. I'm glad we don't have to wait 20 years. You can write that chapter later. When your paper and research is completed, would love to take a look at it. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Max. This was a very compelling episode and really excited to see your work.